The order that changed everything. The cold, metallic walls of the auxiliary warship hummed with energy. Captain James Carter sat on the hard floor of the prison cell, his hands clenched into fists. His body ached from the fight he had put up when they captured him. But he was still alive. That meant they wanted something from him. The door slid open with a sharp hiss. A tall figure stepped inside, his armored boots clicking against the floor. Commander Vayrax. His deep blue skin glowed slightly under the artificial lights. His piercing silver eyes studied James like a scientist looking at an insect. James forced himself to stand. He would not show weakness. Vayrax crossed his arms. You are a soldier of Earth, the leader. That makes you valuable. James smirked. I'd rather be dead than be your prisoner. Vayrax tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Dead soldiers are useless. You will live, but under my command. James laughed bitterly. And if I refuse? Vayrax took a step closer, his presence overpowering. You have no choice. You will follow my orders. James clenched his jaw. He hated this, hated being powerless. But he stayed silent. Vayrax's voice remained cold. You will stay in my quarters. James blinked. What? The alien commander did not repeat himself. He simply turned and gestured for James to follow. James hesitated. Why? You have hundreds of rooms on this ship. Vayrax didn't stop walking. Because I commanded. James had no weapon, no way to fight back. If he refused, they would drag him there anyway. Gritting his teeth, he followed. The quarters were larger than he expected, but still cold and sterile. A sleek metal desk, a few control panels, and James's eyes narrowed. Only one bed. Vayrax walked in and faced him. You will sleep there. James let out a dry laugh. With you? No thanks. Vayrax's expression didn't change. I did not ask for your opinion. James ran a hand through his short brown hair, frustration boiling inside him. Are you doing this to mess with me? Vayrax didn't blink. You are weak. I wish to see if you break. James stepped forward, anger flaring. You think humans are weak? Then fight me. See how weak I really am. Vayrax's lips curled slightly, almost like a smirk. Fighting you would be pointless. Your pride is amusing, but useless. James clenched his fists, but he knew attacking was pointless. This alien was bigger, stronger. He would lose. The commander turned away, removing his armor piece by piece, revealing a body covered in scars. James watched, confused. You have never seen real war, Vayrax said without looking at him. Your world fights battles. My kind fights extinction. James frowned. What are you talking about? Vayrax didn't answer. Instead, he lay on the bed and closed his eyes. James let out a breath. This was madness. He sat down on the cold floor, refusing to take the bed. He wouldn't make this easy for the alien. As silence filled the room, James stared at the ceiling, mind racing. Why did Vayrax want him here? What was his real plan? One thing was clear, this was not just a simple order. Something bigger was happening, and James needed to find out what it was. Trapped with an enemy. James Carter woke to the hum of the alien warship. The air was thick with a strange metallic scent, and the room was colder than before. He shifted, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. His back ached, but he refused to use the bed. The only bed in the room, which belonged to Commander Vayrax. The auxiliary commander lay motionless, his breathing deep and steady. Even in sleep, his presence felt oppressive. His sharp blue skin almost shimmered under the dim overhead light. His chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, like a machine. James hated how calm he looked, like nothing in the universe could touch him. James sat up, his mind still racing from last night. Why had Vayrax ordered him here? Was this some kind of psychological game? A way to break him? He wasn't going to let that happen. The door suddenly slid open with a hiss. A smaller, auxiliary soldier entered, his gaze shifting between James and his commander. The soldier's violet eyes flickered with suspicion. "Commander," the soldier said in a sharp tone, his attention now fully on Veyrax. The commander's eyes snapped open instantly. He didn't move, but James could feel the tension in the air. "What is it?" "Eric." Veyrax's voice was sharp, controlled. "The council is growing impatient," Eric said. "They question why the human is still alive." James tensed. He wasn't fluent in their language, but the ship's translator embedded in his ear worked just fine. He understood every word. Veyrax sat up slowly, his gaze unreadable. "The human is my concern." Eric hesitated. "They do not agree. They demand to know your intentions." James stood, his fists clenching. "Why don't you just tell them the truth? That you want to keep me as a pet?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. Eric glared at him, but Veyrax remained unmoved. "You misunderstand, Captain Carter. You are not my prisoner. You are my test." James narrowed his eyes. "Test for what?" Veyrax stood up, towering over him. "To see if your kind is truly worth saving." The words sent a cold chill through James's spine. "Saving," he repeated. "What the hell are you talking about?" Veyrax ignored him and turned to Eric. "The council will have its answers in due time. Until then, they will not interfere." Eric looked displeased, but bowed his head before leaving. The door shut behind him, locking them in once again. James exhaled sharply. "You're testing me. That's what this is. Keeping me locked in here like some lab rat." Veyrax studied him for a long moment. "No, this is your first lesson in survival." James scoffed. "I've survived wars. I've lost people. I don't need your damn lessons." Veyrax stepped closer, his silver eyes burning with something James couldn't place. "Then tell me, Captain, how many of your enemies have you had to sleep beside? How many times have you trusted someone who wanted to kill you?" James clenched his jaw. "Never." Veyrax nodded. "That is why humans lose. You do not understand the true nature of war." James refused to look away. "And what exactly do you know about war?" Veyrax finally broke eye contact and walked toward the control panel. He pressed a few buttons, and a holographic screen lit up. James's breath caught in his throat. It was Earth, or at least what was left of it. The image showed massive destruction. Cities in ruins, smoke rising from the remains of once great civilizations. Fires burned across continents. The oceans were dark with debris. James's heart pounded. What is this?" Veyrax's voice was quiet, but firm. "Your future." James shook his head. "That's impossible. Earth is still standing." "For now," Veyrax agreed. "But the war you think you are fighting is nothing compared to what is coming. Your enemies are not the auxiliary. They are something worse." James felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He had thought Veyrax was his enemy. He had thought the auxiliary were humanity's greatest threat. But what if he was wrong? "What are you saying?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Veyrax turned off the screen. "I am saying that if you do not learn, if you do not change, Earth will burn." James's pulse raced. Every instinct told him not to trust this alien. But deep down, something told him that Veyrax wasn't lying. For the first time since his capture, James felt something worse than anger. He felt fear, hidden truths, and dangerous games. James Carter sat on the cold metal floor, his back against the wall, his mind racing. The holographic image of Earth's destruction had burned itself into his memory. His home, his people, were standing on the edge of a war they didn't even know existed. And the only one who seemed to care was the alien standing across from him. Veyrax, the auxiliary commander, stood with his arms crossed, watching him with unreadable silver eyes. "Tell me," James said finally, his voice low. "Who's coming for Earth?" Veyrax didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the control panel and pressed a series of buttons. A holographic projection appeared, displaying a map of the galaxy. A red-marked zone flickered in the outer edges of the screen. "The Draxians," Veyrax said. "They are not like us. They do not conquer planets for resources. They do not enslave or negotiate. They erase." James frowned. "Erase." "They consume," Veyrax explained, his voice flat. "They strip a world of its resources, its people. They leave nothing behind. Only death." James swallowed. The weight of his words settled in his gut like a stone. "If they're so dangerous," James said, standing, "why haven't you stopped them?" Veyrax exhaled sharply. "Because they are stronger than us." That was not what James had expected to hear. The Xilari, the same empire that had overpowered humanity's forces so easily, were admitting weakness. "Then why not warn Earth?" James asked. "Why not help us fight?" Veyrax turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Would your people listen? Or would they see us as invaders, as enemies?" James wanted to argue, but deep down, he knew the truth. Earth didn't trust aliens. If the Xilari arrived with a warning, humanity would assume it was a trick. "So, what's your plan?" James asked. Veyrax hesitated. "I am still considering." James let out a frustrated breath. "Great. So you dragged me into your quarters, made me your personal experiment, and you don't even have a plan." Veyrax's gaze darkened. "I do not act without thought, Captain Carter. Unlike your kind, I do not waste resources." James clenched his fists, but before he could say anything else, the lights in the room flickered. The ship rumbled, the faint sound of alarms humming through the walls. Something was wrong. Veyrax moved to the control panel, his fingers gliding over the interface. His eyes widened slightly. A rare reaction from him. "We are being boarded." James straightened. "Who?" Veyrax's expression hardened. "Not my people." The door suddenly hissed open, and Eric, Veyrax's second-in-command, rushed inside, his face tense. "Commander, the intruders are inside the lower decks," Eric reported. "Unknown species, they bypassed our defenses." James exchanged a glance with Veyrax. "Unknown species. That didn't sound good." "How many?" Veyrax asked. "Too many," Eric admitted. "They are not here to negotiate." Veyrax turned to James. "This is your moment, Captain Carter. You wish to prove your strength? Now is your chance." James scoffed. "You think I'm just gonna fight for you?" Veyrax grabbed a weapon from the wall and tossed it to James. He caught it instinctively. "Fight for yourself," Veyrax said, "or die." James looked down at the sleek, unfamiliar alien rifle in his hands. He had no idea how to use it, but one thing was clear. He wasn't about to sit here and wait for death. Without another word, he followed Veyrax and Eric into the hall. The ship's corridors were already littered with bodies, both Xilari and something else. James had seen a lot of terrifying things in war, but the creatures that stalked the hallway were unlike anything he had ever faced. They were tall, their skin an oily black that seemed to shimmer under the artificial lights. Their limbs were too long, their fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. Their eyes were a sickly green, glowing in the dim corridor. James raised his weapon, gripping it tightly. "What the hell are these things?" "Draxian scouts," Veyrax answered. "The first wave. Escape or betrayal." The ship trembled under the force of explosions. The eerie screeches of the Draxians echoed through the corridors, growing closer with every passing second. James Carter gritted his teeth, gripping the alien rifle tightly. His breath was steady, but his heart pounded like a war drum. Beside him, Commander Veyrax moved with swift precision, his silver eyes scanning the shadows. The Exilari commander never showed fear, but James could tell he wasn't calm. He was calculating, preparing for the worst. A sudden screech erupted from the ceiling vents. James barely had time to react before a Draxian scout lunged at him, its sickly green eyes glowing in the dim corridor. He rolled to the side just as razor-sharp claws swiped through the air where his head had been. James didn't hesitate. He aimed for the creature's head and fired. The blast burned through its skull, sending its body crashing to the floor in a twitching heap. Veyrax gave him a sharp look. "Good. You are learning." James exhaled. "Yeah. Well, I'd rather not die learning." More screeches filled the corridor. James and Veyrax turned in unison, seeing the approaching swarm. Half a dozen Draxians moved in unholy synchronization, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they crawled along walls and ceilings. Eric, the Exilari second in command, stepped forward. "We cannot hold this position," he said in his clipped military tone. "We need to fall back to the command center." Veyrax didn't move. He seemed to be thinking, but James didn't like how long it was taking. James turned to Eric. "Your command center. Can you lock it down? Keep these things out." Eric's jaw tightened. "For a time." James nodded. "Then let's move." Veyrax finally spoke. "No." James spun to face him. "No. We're about to be overrun." The Exilari commander was completely unfazed. "We need to reach the lower decks." Eric's head snapped toward him. "That is suicide." James frowned. "What's in the lower decks?" Veyrax's gaze didn't waver. "Answers." James' patience was wearing thin. "And what the hell does that mean?" Before Veyrax could respond, another explosion rocked the ship, knocking James off balance. A deafening alarm blared through the halls. Then James heard something new. A voice. A human voice. He froze, his eyes darting toward a nearby terminal. The ship's interface flickered with a distorted transmission. Static crackled through the speakers, but James caught a few words. "Do you read me? This is Colonel Erickson of Earth's Defense Command. The Exilari were right. The invasion has begun. Do not." The transmission cut out. James stared, his blood running cold. That was an Earth military frequency. Someone from Earth's forces had been in contact with the Exilari. They had known about the Draxians before this, and they hadn't warned him. James turned sharply to Veyrax. "You knew about this." Veyrax met his gaze, but didn't deny it. "Yes." James took a step closer, his fists clenched. "So, what am I? Some kind of experiment? A pawn in your game?" Veyrax's voice remained calm. "You are a soldier. You deserve the truth." James wasn't sure if that was an answer or a manipulation. Eric stepped forward, looking at his commander in disbelief. "You have been in contact with humans." Veyrax didn't look at him. His attention remained on James. "I was in contact with a faction of your military, Captain. A faction that believed war with the Exilari was a distraction, that the real war was coming." James clenched his jaw. "And you let them keep it a secret." Veyrax's expression hardened. "They believed humanity was not ready." James wanted to scream. Millions of lives were at stake, and these people had played politics with survival. "We're wasting time," Eric snapped. "Commander, we need to leave before the Draxians overrun the ship." James exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. Anger wouldn't save him right now. "What's in the lower decks?" he asked again. Veyrax's voice was quiet, but firm. "A weapon." James's breath caught. "A weapon that can stop them." Veyrax didn't answer, but that silence said everything. James looked down at the rifle in his hands. He was out of choices. "We go to the lower decks," James said. Eric looked furious, but Veyrax gave a slight nod. "Then we move now." They navigated the ship's corridors with speed, but the deeper they went, the darker it became. Emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. The air smelled of burned metal and blood. Then James saw them. Dead Exilari soldiers. Dozens of them, their bodies shredded apart, their weapons useless beside them. James swallowed hard. This was a massacre. Veyrax's face remained unreadable. They never stood a chance. Then, Up ahead, they saw it. A massive door, reinforced with alien technology, stood at the end of the hall. It pulsed with a faint blue light. Veyrax stepped forward, placing his hand on the console. The door let out a low mechanical hiss and began to open. Inside was something James didn't expect. Not a weapon, not a machine, a person. She was human, or at least, she looked human. She stood in the center of the chamber, suspended in some kind of energy field. Her body was perfectly still, her eyes closed. But James could feel it. Power. James turned to Veyrax, his voice sharp. Who the hell is she? Veyrax's silver eyes locked onto James. She is humanity's last hope. James felt the weight of those words. And for the first time, he wondered if this war was bigger than anything he could have imagined. The battle for survival. The chamber was silent, except for the low hum of energy surrounding the floating woman. James Carter took a cautious step forward, his fingers tightening around the alien rifle. She was human, or at least she looked human. Long dark hair floated weightlessly around her face, her skin untouched by scars or age. The faint blue glow of the energy field flickered, illuminating the sharp angles of her face. Veyrax stood beside James, his silver eyes locked on the figure before them. His expression was unreadable, but James could sense something beneath his cold exterior. "This is what you call a weapon?" James asked, keeping his voice low. "She is more than a weapon," Veyrax replied. "She is the key." James exhaled sharply. He was tired of cryptic answers. The Draxians were tearing through the ship. Earth was in danger. And now he was staring at a mystery wrapped in an energy field. "We don't have time for riddles, Veyrax," James said. "Wake her up." Veyrax stepped to the console and entered a series of alien symbols. The energy field flickered, then collapsed with a sudden rush of air. The woman's body dropped, but before she could hit the ground, her eyes snapped open. Brilliant white irises glowed as she landed on her feet without a sound. James took a step back, instincts screaming at him. Her gaze darted between them, unreadable, assessing. Then her lips parted. "You're late." James blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman tilted her head, studying him. "You are James Carter. You are the one they chose." James exchanged a sharp glance with Veyrax. "Who chose me?" The woman ignored the question and turned to Veyrax. "The ship is compromised. The Draxians are already inside. You should have activated me sooner." James' patience was running thin. "Who the hell are you?" She turned back to him, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "My name is Lyra. I was created to stop the extinction of your world." James felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. "Created?" Lyra nodded. "I am not human. Not fully. I was engineered by a coalition of species, including the Exilari, to be the first hybrid soldier capable of standing against the Draxians." James scoffed. "So, what? You're some kind of super soldier." Lyra's expression didn't change. "I am the only chance your kind has to survive." James shook his head. "I don't believe this. You expect me to trust some lab-grown science experiment." Lyra took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't have a choice." Before James could respond, the ship's alarms blared again. A metallic voice echoed through the speakers. "Warning. Huol Biriichi in CC2R5. Boarding party is DTCTE." Eric cursed under his breath. "They're almost here." Lyra turned sharply to Veyrax. "Do you still have access to the war drones?" Veyrax's jaw tightened. "Only a limited number. The rest were disabled when they infiltrated our systems." Lyra nodded. "Then we take what we have and fight our way to the escape pods." James frowned. "Escape? What about the weapon?" Lyra exhaled sharply. "I am the weapon, Captain, and I cannot be destroyed here." James stared at her. Every instinct screamed at him not to trust her, but deep down, he knew one thing. He didn't have any better options. "Fine," he said. "But if this is some kind of trick, I'll kill you myself." Lyra smiled slightly. "Noted." The battle begins. The corridors were a war zone. James, Lyra, and the auxiliary soldiers moved swiftly, cutting through waves of Draxian scouts. James had seen a lot of horrors in his time as a soldier, but the Draxians were something else. They didn't fight like normal creatures. They were fast, unpredictable, moving like liquid shadows, crawling on walls and ceilings with sickening precision. Lyra was faster. She moved like a blur, her reflexes beyond human. Every shot from her plasma weapon was precise, every motion calculated. She dodged, ducked, and struck with an efficiency that James could hardly believe. Even Veyrax seemed impressed. The war drones followed them, small mechanical orbs hovering in the air, firing blasts of energy at the incoming creatures. But it wasn't enough. "They're pushing us back," Eric shouted. James gritted his teeth. They had to keep moving. Suddenly, Lyra stopped. She turned her head sharply, as if sensing something. "Run," she said. James frowned. "What?" Her glowing eyes locked onto his. "Now." Then, from the darkness of the corridor, something massive emerged. A Draxian brute. Unlike the scouts, this one was nearly twice the size of a human, its body covered in shifting black armor. It let out a low guttural growl before lunging forward. James barely had time to react before Lyra grabbed him and threw him backward, just as the brute's massive claw smashed into the floor where he had been standing. "Go!" Lyra shouted. Veyrax and Eric opened fire, their weapons lighting up the corridor. But the brute barely flinched. It charged, faster than anything that large should be, slamming into Eric and sending him flying into a wall. James scrambled to his feet. "We can't fight this thing." Lyra's eyes flashed. "I can." Before anyone could stop her, she lunged. James watched in shock as Lyra moved like lightning, dodging the brute's attacks with inhuman speed. She leaped onto its back, gripping its armored head. Then, with a blinding surge of energy, she tore it apart. The brute let out a final, choking screech before collapsing. Lyra stood over it, breathing hard, her hands still crackling with raw energy. James stared. "What the hell are you?" he muttered. Lyra turned to him. "The only thing that can stop the Draxians." James swallowed. He had seen a lot of impossible things in this war, but this was something else entirely. The final choice. The warship trembled under the assault. The air smelled of scorched metal and burning flesh, the echoes of battle ringing through the shattered corridors. James Carter had fought in countless battles before, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Draxians weren't just invaders, they were executioners. And now, they were coming for Lyra. She stood in the center of the ruined hallway, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Her breathing was steady, her posture calm. But James could feel it. Something was wrong. Lyra wasn't just a soldier. She was something else. James glanced at Veyrax, who remained as unreadable as ever, his silver eyes locked onto Lyra like a man watching a ticking bomb. Eric stood nearby, still injured from the last fight, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The escape pods were just ahead. If they could make it, they had a chance. But James had learned something in war. Things were never that easy. And he was right. A sudden boom shook the entire deck, and the walls split apart, metal groaning under pressure. James turned sharply, raising his weapon. And then, from the darkness, the real enemy arrived. The Draxian warlord. It was huge. The brute they had fought earlier was a child compared to the monster that now emerged. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, its black armor pulsed with a sickly green light, shifting and reforming like liquid steel. Jagged bone-like protrusions jutted from its shoulders, and its elongated skull bore rows of needle-sharp teeth. But the worst part, its eyes. Unlike the mindless Draxian drones, this one thought. It was intelligent. It had been waiting. Human, The creature spoke, its voice like a blade scraping against stone. You do not belong here. James tightened his grip on his weapon. Yeah, well, neither do you. The warlord ignored him. Its gaze settled on Lyra. You, it said, voice filled with something almost like amusement. We have been searching for you. Lyra remained still. Her glowing white eyes flickered. And now you found me. James didn't like this. The way she spoke, it was like she knew this thing. What the hell is going on? James demanded. Lyra turned to him. This is their leader, the one who commands the extermination of worlds. James clenched his jaw. And why does he care about you? The warlord took a slow step forward, the ground beneath it cracking under its weight. Because she is not what you think, it said. She is not your ally. James felt his pulse quicken. He turned to Lyra, searching for some kind of denial, some kind of explanation. But she said nothing. Veyrax finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled. She was made from their kind. James' stomach dropped. What? He whispered. Veyrax's expression was grim. Lyra is a hybrid, part human, part Draxian. The warlord let out a deep, guttural chuckle. Now you understand. Human. James' mind reeled. The pieces started fitting together. The way Lyra moved, the power she had, the inhuman glow of her eyes. She wasn't a weapon against the Draxians. She was one of them. Betrayal or salvation. James took a step back. His mind screamed at him to raise his weapon, to end this before it was too late. But Lyra finally spoke. I was created to stop them, she said, not to serve them. The warlord laughed again. Is that what they told you? That you were born to protect humanity? It took another step forward, its towering frame casting a long shadow over the ruined corridor. You are ours, child, it hissed. You were never meant to save them. You were meant to lead them to extinction. James felt something cold wrap around his chest. He turned to Lyra. Tell me it's not true. She met his gaze. It doesn't matter what I was made for. Her voice was steady, but there was something else in it now. Something uncertain. James could barely breathe. It matters to me. The warlord raised one clawed hand. Come with us, daughter, it said, its voice almost gentle. It is time. Lyra's fingers curled into fists. I am not yours. The warlord tilted its head. Then prove it. And then it attacked. The last stand. Everything happened at once. The warlord moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between them in a blink. James dove aside as claws slashed through the air, barely missing him. Lyra lunged, meeting the creature head-on. Their clash sent a shockwave through the corridor, knocking James off his feet. Veyrax grabbed his arm, hauling him up. We need to move. James shook his head. No, we need to help her. Veyrax hesitated, then nodded. Then we fight. Eric opened fire, his plasma rifle lighting up the corridor. The warlord barely flinched as the shots ricocheted off his armor. Lyra fought with raw power, her strikes sending shockwaves through the walls. But James could see it. She was struggling. She was losing. And then it happened. The warlord struck hard, sending Lyra crashing into the wall. She slumped to the ground, unmoving. James didn't think. He acted. Gripping his rifle, he charged. He fired shot after shot, aiming for the cracks in the warlord's shifting armor. Nothing. The warlord turned, its sickly green eyes locking onto him. You are weak, it said. James clenched his jaw. Yeah, well, I don't need to be strong. Then he threw his rifle aside and pulled the detonator from his belt. Veyrax's eyes widened. Carter, don't. James pressed the button. The corridor erupted in fire. The explosion ripped through the walls, sending debris flying. The force slammed James backward, pain searing through his body as he hit the ground hard. For a moment, Everything was silent. Then, through the smoke, a figure emerged. Lyra. She was burned, bleeding, but standing. And the warlord. Gone. James groaned, pushing himself up. Did we get him? Lyra exhaled. No, but he won't come back soon. Verax helped James to his feet. The ship is failing. We need to leave. James nodded. His body screamed in pain, but they had no choice. As they stumbled toward the escape pods, James turned to Lyra. You could have gone with them, he said. Lyra met his gaze. I know. James exhaled. He didn't trust her. Not yet. But she had made her choice, and soon they would all face the consequences. The last stand. The escape pod shuddered as it entered Earth's atmosphere, the metal shell glowing from the intense heat of re-entry. Inside, James Carter gripped the edges of his seat, his breath slow and measured, his mind racing. The war wasn't over. They had escaped the Xilari warship, but that meant nothing. The Draxians were still out there. The warlord hadn't died in the explosion. James knew that much. And then there was Lyra. She sat across from him, staring out the small viewport, her glowing white eyes reflecting the flames outside. She hadn't spoken much since they left the ship. Neither had James, because deep down, a question haunted him. Had they just brought Earth's greatest hope back home? Or had they brought its destruction? The landing. The escape pod crashed down in a barren stretch of land, deep within a classified military base in the Nevada desert. The moment they hit the ground, alarms blared. James barely had time to unbuckle before the doors were forced open. Armed soldiers surrounded them instantly, weapons raised. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. Stand down. James turned, recognizing Colonel Erickson, the same man he had heard in the broken transmission aboard the Xilari ship. The older man stepped forward, eyes sharp, face carved from years of war. James stumbled out of the pod, coughing. Nice welcome. Erickson ignored the sarcasm, his gaze shifting to Lyra. His expression hardened. What is she? James hesitated. Then finally, he said, she's the reason we're still alive. Erickson's jaw tightened. And is she the reason we're about to lose? Lyra finally spoke. If I wanted Earth to fall, I wouldn't have fought against them. The soldiers kept their weapons raised, uncertain. Erickson exhaled sharply. Get them inside. We need to talk. The truth about Earth. The underground facility was cold, sterile, and humming with activity. Screens lined the walls, showing battle reports from across the solar system. It was worse than James had imagined. Draxian scouts had already reached Mars. The moon bases were on high alert. Earth's defenses were stretched thin. The invasion had begun. James leaned over the holographic display, eyes scanning the red warning signs flashing across the map. How long do we have? Erickson's voice was grim. Days. Maybe less. James ran a hand through his hair. And you knew about them this whole time. Erickson met his gaze. We suspected, but we didn't have proof until it was too late. James clenched his fists. You had proof the moment the Xilari told you. Silence. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This isn't just war anymore. This is extinction. Lyra stepped forward. Not if we stop them. Erickson crossed his arms. And how do we do that? She hesitated. We go to their source. James frowned. Their source. Lyra looked at him, something unreadable in her glowing eyes. The warlord you faced, he is not their leader. He is only the beginning. Erickson narrowed his eyes. Then who is the leader? Lyra turned back to the screen. Their queen. A chill ran through James' spine. The Draxians don't have rulers, he said. Lyra didn't look away from the display. Not in the way you understand. She is their will, their mind. She controls them all. James' throat went dry. And where is she? Lyra exhaled. On their homeworld. James shook his head. You're suggesting we launch an attack on an entire Draxian planet? Lyra turned to face him. Yes. The suicide mission. The room fell into stunned silence. Erickson sighed. Even if we could get there, how do you expect us to win? Lyra's expression was calm, unwavering. You can't. James scoffed. Great plan. Lyra stepped closer. I can. James froze. You don't understand, Carter, she said, her voice softer now. I wasn't just made to fight. I was made to connect. She pressed her fingertips against the screen, and for a brief second, the lights flickered. The screens pulsed. James' pulse quickened. What the hell are you doing? Lyra turned to him. If I get close enough, I can override the Draxian hive mind. James stared at her. You're saying you can control them? Lyra nodded. For a moment. But a moment is all we need. Erickson shook his head. And if you fail? Lyra's glowing eyes met James. Then I become what I was always meant to be. One of them. A cold silence filled the room. James hated this. Every instinct told him this was a trap, that he was leading his people into an unwinnable battle. But the alternative was watching Earth burn. And that wasn't an option. He took a slow breath. Then finally, he said, when do we leave? The final battle. The fleet moved swiftly, the best of Earth's forces, the last of the Scifi warships, every soldier, every pilot, every warrior who was willing to fight. James stood on the bridge, watching as the massive Draxian homeworld loomed ahead. It was like a graveyard of planets, surrounded by wreckage of the civilizations they had already consumed. The Queen was waiting. Lyra stood beside him, silent. Ready. James turned to her. You sure about this? Lyra didn't hesitate. Yes. He studied her for a long moment. For what it's worth, I trust you. Lyra's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. That makes one of us. Then the alarms blared. The final battle had begun. Epilogue. The price of war. The battle was chaos. Ships burned, weapons fired, bodies fell. The Draxian Queen was massive, her mind stretching across the entire planet. But Lyra reached her. James watched as she stood before the monstrous entity, her glowing eyes locking onto the Queen's. Then, everything stopped. The Draxians froze. Ships powered down. Weapons ceased firing. And in that moment, Lyra whispered two words. Sleep now. The Queen shuddered. Then she collapsed. And with her, the Draxian army fell. James exhaled, his knees nearly giving out. They had won. But when he turned to Lyra, she was gone. Her body had vanished. Only a faint whisper remained in the wind. I was never meant to stay. James closed his eyes. The war was over. But some battles never truly end.